All right. As I said before at the beginning, my name is Joshua Eisenman. I'm an assistant professor here, and I coordinate the Understanding China initiative at the Strauss Center. And so this is my book that just came out. So I'm going to present on this for about 20 minutes or so, and then turn it over to this august panel that you should be familiar with, who's going to tell me how I got it all wrong. So before I get started, can anybody see just on this picture the tribute to Texas? I'll give you a hint. Yeah. All right, so this is the Texas Museum here, and this is a house in rural Shandong province, right? So one of the few places where you can see the same exact star in a very different cultural context. So I want to begin with talking about the People's Commune, and this came up in Professor Li Huayan's comments earlier. But the Chinese Commune existed for 25 years, and this is somewhat surprising, I think, to many, because we often paint the Commune with the brush of something called the Great Leap Forward, which was only 3 years, but the institution persisted for another 22 after that. It was rural China's foremost economic, political, and military institution, which is to say that all three of these came under the leadership of the Commune and its cadres. These were interlinked. They were not separated out into economic institutions and political institutions. They were all under the leadership of the cadre of the People's Commune. And to give you a sense of how big this thing was, at its peak size in 1980, you had over 800 million people living in the Commune, 82% of all Chinese people, and about 1 out of every 5.5 people on Earth was a Commune member at one time. So it gives you a sense that we're dealing with a big issue and a lot of people. Here gives you a sense of where it fits in the governance structure of rural China at the time. The Commune system actually encompassed these, you could call them 4 levels, although they often talk about a 3-tier. The Commune, the brigade, and the team, and the household, of course, the only organic, naturally occurring element of this here. And now, when you get rid of the Commune, you strip away these 3 layers here. So, I want to go through the document, a couple of myths about the Commune. And in your folders, or perhaps in the stack there, there's an op-ed I wrote in the Washington Post where I go through 3 of these. So I'm going to go through 3 of them, and then I'm going to give you a 4th that's not in there. So a little bonus for coming out here today. So the first myth is that low Commune productivity led farmers to abandon collective agriculture and return to household farming. And again, Professor Li talked about this quite a bit. The fact, however, is that agricultural productivity, life expectancy, and basic education increased substantially during this period. And I'm not going to ask you to trust me, I'm going to show you. Here is aggregate agricultural productivity in China for grain, pigs, and edible oils. The reason I have these is because these are the things that came under the leadership of the Commune, so they're measurable. I cannot tell you how many apples were grown or how many peanuts were grown. That's a much harder thing. But these were under the leadership of the Commune. We can see here the Great Leap Forward disaster. Then we can see the recovery. We can see the 3 years that Professor Solinger mentioned here during the Cultural Revolution, where you also have a reduction. But starting in 1970, we have rapid increases in agricultural productivity in China on aggregate. If we look by unit land, which is how classical economics would look at this, we can see these are even more drastic, because as you take land out of farming and put it into industry, the productivity per unit land increases. But China's population increased rapidly at this time, so when we do it by population, we get a less steep line, but still, even amid rapid growth in population, we still see increases after 1970 in agricultural productivity. And after edible oils were liberalized in the economy under Hua Guofeng, we see rapid increases in edible oils as well. Life expectancy. This is from the World Bank, and you can get a sense here of India's increasing life expectancy, the US here increasing, the Soviet Union actually falling, and then this kind of unprecedented increase you have from 1964 until 1979, where your average Chinese person goes from living about 46 years to about 66 years. To my knowledge, and I'd be interested if anybody could tell me otherwise, this is unprecedented in human history. A 20-year increase in life expectancy in such a short period of time. Here is the student enrollment numbers. You can see the rapid increases in enrollment of students as occurred in 1970. It was mentioned, I believe by Professor Blecker, that if you really want bang for your buck, you invest in educating girls. A lot of that is what's going on here. Simply put, prior to the Commune, China was not almost entirely, but largely illiterate society unless you were an elite. After the Commune, China was a literate society, not only in terms of reading, but also in terms of numbers, double book accounting, and other things which had previously not made it down to the grassroots level. Here you can get a sense of the primary, middle, and high school enrollment numbers. Again, you see these increases, but in 1977, 78, flat lines and decreasing. So after the reform and opening up, there are actually less children in school, although population does not go down. So, myth number 2. The government allowed rural markets and private enterprises only after reform and opening up. And this is something you'll see regularly repeated in newspapers. The fact is that private household plots, small-scale animal husbandry, cottage enterprises, and rural markets, known as the 3 small freedoms, were formally adopted after 1962 in something called the 60 Articles. And these practices remained throughout the remainder of the Commune era, including during the Cultural Revolution. And I watched many times as older Chinese debated their children on this, and it got a little heated. But yes, during the Cultural Revolution, there were rural Chinese markets. So what were the 3 small freedoms? First, private plots. I should also say these are not only enshrined in the 60 Articles, but remained policy throughout the entire Commune era. Private plots, cottage enterprises, and rural free markets. It's important to mention, as has been noted, that these are limited in scope. You cannot build a cottage enterprise or a household enterprise. You could not just continually build it ad infinitum. There were limitations on size. And in rural free markets, the word free should actually be in quotes because you could not sell everything you wanted. You could not sell, first and foremost, grain. Grain was not to be sold at these markets. But ancillary products, if you made some shoes or like put in your shoes or sweaters or whatever, those things could be sold at these markets. These are the only images I've ever seen of rural markets in Maoist China. They're not something that has been really publicized by the regime. These were pictures taken by a woman named Peggy Prince, who visited this market herself. And you can see here, this is not a black market. This is not a secret. In fact, these are foreigners who were taken to see this. So this is something occurring in the amphitheater in an open and organic way. And you can see this gentleman here using cash to purchase a goose.
And which province?
This is in Guangdong province. Here again, you can see the use of cash in these markets, and again, hardly a secret, right? This is not behind the building, this is out in public. But you can also see the poverty these people were living in. These people are not only extremely thin, but look at their feet, barefoot. Look at the clothes they're wearing. So while we can say that the Commune rapidly increased productivity, it most definitely did not increase household incomes. And that was intentional. We can talk more about that. But why do this at all? Isn't China a communist society? Why would you allow household production in the Commune at all? Well, the first is the Great Leap Forward failed largely because it did not put a consumption floor under people's feet, so people starved. But if people have household property, even if it's only 5 to 7%, they can at least be more confident in their own survival. There is a variation in economies of scale that you can take advantage of when you're doing things on multiple levels. Grain is best done collectively. It's very similar, you can tractorize it, but other things, particularly vegetables, pigs, fruits, these things are best done hand to hand in a household context, and the productivity output is better. So if you allow for household production, you actually increase productivity, and you use a lot of resources that would have been wasted on these bigger plots. You then take those extra resources and you can provide them to households for use on their private plots. You prevent the emergence of a black market. If you keep this under the leadership of the Commune, then there isn't a black market that emerges that it's beyond your control. So it was essential to keep the party in charge, so you kept this under the leadership of the party. It also gave essential pricing information to cadres. When they were making decisions on where to invest very scarce resources, knowing what was going for a high price in the market could help them to make those decisions. Do they want to invest in a fertilizer plant? Do they want to invest in pesticides? The pricing information they were receiving helped them make these decisions. And as you saw in the images, a lot of people who were at these markets were old and young. And these are people who are not making work points, who are not out in the fields. So allowing them to work the family private plot and then sell things at the market kept them a useful and productive part of society and contributing both to the family and giving them a role. And it was also politically acceptable for a person who had been their entire life living under the bad old days to, well, go to the market. That was acceptable politically, whereas the younger folks should be knowing better. So myth 3. Reform and opening up launched an ethos of development that industrialized rural China, and prior to that, rural workers slacked off regularly. And this goes to a point that had been raised earlier that Professor Lee mentioned. The fact is that after 1970, China reformed the commune in ways that increased investment and made it more productive. Able-bodied farmers rarely slacked or shirked collective labor. Rather, communes incentivized farmers to overwork and then underpay them for their labor. This theory begins, I don't know if it begins, but the most notable person is the Nobel Prize-winning economist W. Arthur Lewis in his famous article, Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor, where he concludes that the central problem in the theory of economic development is how an economy with an unlimited labor force living just above subsistence can cut consumption and save more. We cannot explain an industrial revolution until we explain why savings increased. And that was what the commune did. The goal was to increase savings to support productive investment, but the question is, how do you extract money from poor, especially the kind of money you need to industrialize a country as big as China? And this is where the turning point came in 1970. Zhou Enlai was put in charge of agriculture, which was a change. And of course, he was under Mao's leadership, but he was put in charge of it on a day-to-day basis. And something called the Northern District Agricultural Conference was hosted. This was not just a one-day conference like we're having here. This was a 1-month-long conference where they started in a place called Dajai for 3 weeks, and then they moved to Beijing, and they moved up a level to higher levels. But this was every county leader, and I showed you the list, in all of northern China was at this conference. It was a massive enterprise, and the whole idea was to rejuvenate what we call the Dajai model, or the People's Commune. And the message was clear. Here's put out an image of Zhou Enlai working, and here it says, Zhou Enlai, together with us, has happiness and bitterness. So the idea, propaganda-wise, was get ready to eat some bitterness. Right? This is going to be hard, but it's going to be something we're going to be doing together. So Harry Harding writes that China's post-1970 agricultural modernization campaign aimed to mobilize every possible resource, be it human, monetary, material. And what he called this was super-optimal investment. The goal was not to allow farmers to decide how much they consumed, but to extract everything you possibly could while keeping them alive and functioning, and then reinvest into the local economy in order to increase productivity. And he did this through something called the work point system. We can go into this a little bit more detail, but there are some elements of this system which are essential to its success. First, it was local. You wanted to earn work points, you had to work locally. If you worked and you earned work points and then you left, you could not redeem those work points outside of the place you lived. So it kept people local. It was essential to ensuring that you knew how many workers you had and preventing brain drain outside of your unit. Second, it was collective. No one person could get rich in the commune unless his or her neighbors got rich too. The determination of the value of the work point was based on a collective accumulation. It was public. And actually, Professor Lee's book has a great description of this. I would all commend you. They would post the amount of work points everybody received outside the leader's door. And he has a great description in his book of the old ladies running every day to see and check their work points. And that if their work points were off even by one, they would immediately seek redress. And the public nature of this meant that corruption was particularly difficult. And it also meant that everybody had a competition with all of those around them. If I knew that Mark was making one more work point than me, then that would upset me and I would seek redress on that. And this kept a kind of open and transparent environment. Extraction was ex ante, which means you work first, then you get paid. And this meant that you could not, the commune could not go into debt. It would simply dilute the value of the work point all the more. And it was flexible, and this is particularly important after 1970. After 1970, all different types of work points were allowed. task rates, piece rates, time rates. Previously, this had been more tightly controlled under what was called the Dajai work point. But after 1970, you had to use work points. You did, but you had more flexibility in how you were awarding the work points.
When you said you couldn't go into debt, who is you?
You mean the...
You said you couldn't go into debt.
The collective. The collective. The individual household could go into debt. They could owe the collective. But the collective itself wouldn't go into debt. It would simply dilute the value of the work point and target more resources into investment. And how did it work then? Here is the commune members' share of collective income. We can see the extraction during the Great Leap Forward. We can see the return of consumption up to 60% by Deng Xiaoping. And then we can see from 1962 steadily until 1977-78, we see a gradual return to 50%. But from my knowledge, nobody was starving in 1978, although the percentage of extraction was exactly the same as the height of the Great Leap Forward, which means the percentage being extracted was the same, but people were not starving, which means that the total amount of productivity had to have gone up in order for that not to happen. We can see after 1978 here, reform and opening up begins, and we can see a rapid increase in household consumption. Rapid increase in household consumption. It's no wonder Deng Xiaoping was a very popular guy at this time. People's income rose substantially. But it wasn't enough just to extract. Extracting alone won't do it. You need to invest as well. And that's where the agricultural research and extension system came in. This was a system nested into every single level I showed you. When you ripped out the commune, you also ripped this out too. So this is a problem China is still dealing with. But this system here was an all hands-on-deck approach. You can see here is a small group working on fertilizers, and you can see here you've got young children, you've got old peasants, you've got young women, you've got the entire representation of China here working on that. Here are some young children learning about how to store grain, and here's a young group here working hard to increase the productivity as well. But the sense is this is not an elite activity. This is not something that occurs with people in white jackets far, far away, and then you get the seeds. This is something you are involved in. Your children are involved in. It's in every single level, and it's all about investing those extracted resources in a productive way. Brigade enterprises were also an important part of this. Both communes and brigades had enterprises, and most of these later turned into what was called the town and village enterprises. So I would dispute those who say that these things sprung up organically. There was a basis already for them under the Mao period. Here you can see a duck farm, and here you can see a bamboo basket making factory. These pictures by Peggy Prince, and of course above you see Nongye Shui Dajai. So politics, always present. Nongye Shui Dajai is the movement at this time. And how did it work then? Well, you can see after 1970, just a rapid climb in investment, kind of across the board. And it's here in about 1979, 1980 that this investment-led growth strategy more or less comes to an end, and China begins what I would consider a much more consumption-led growth strategy. Machine cultivation, similar trend, straight up and then down. Agricultural capital. You can see these inflection points are almost all in 1970.